I'd like to introduce Ashish Patel for Metabadger Automation IMDS. Welcome. I'll let you get started.
Okay, awesome. Thanks everybody for attending my talk. So today we'll be talking about automating IMDS protection scale, like I mentioned as well, and then a tool that we wrote called Metabadger. Really interesting name, definitely something that had a lot of thought put into it. So who am I? I'm a security engineer at Brex right now. I really like working on a lot of different things involving the cloud security space and infrastructure. I think there's a lot of different various areas in this space that could use some automation as well as just overall insight of how you build tooling and letting robots do things for you to help the overall posture of that environment. And I really think that like shifting left and moving a lot of configurations into infrastructure as code, as well as kind of pushing some of these default configurations into a secure state is super important. And this is something that I've kind of been passionate about. I've investigated things in the past at different roles and so forth over the years. And then the tooling behind all this, right, should really be able to enable the software engineers that you're working with and also provide guardrails. So how do we actually mitigate these things in a way where they're not as empowering with this like friction, against the different engineering teams and so forth. So doing it in a way that's a little bit more seamless, right? And so, why Metabadger? Why metadata in general? A lot of folks will ask this question, and really the metadata service is what instances use to actually get all the context they need about what they're doing. So the role itself that gets pulled onto the instance, and then the credentials that the instance is using are all essentially used by the instance to then get context for the different things it'll access inside of an AWS environment, right? So you might have an instance that has access to S3 buckets or to RDS or other things that needs to talk to, and so it'll actually talk to the IMDS service that'll get pulled down, and then the instance has the context to go ahead and do that. There's been a numerous amount of known kind of SSRF vulnerabilities and exploits that have existed in the past around this. There's been some pretty popular attacks that have existed before 2019. So those have been prevalent since then. And then V2 was actually released in 2019. So that was the updated version of the metadata service that AWS released. And credential leaking, from this attack and exploit vector is actually pretty bad, because whatever this instance has access to, that's essentially what the attacker would be able to then exploit. So this is kind of a breakdown of the two different versions of the instance metadata service. The first one in origin, right, is a very simple type of request, right? So you're just making a request up to the metadata service that'll give you back a response, and that'll essentially pipe your credentials or whatever else that you're asking for from the service back to it, right? And there's only one method that's used there, just a put method that's on the instance. This will just get asked up to the actual service. It'll just give you that back, right? So it's not doing any auth there. There's no token. There's nothing involved there. And this is where, a lot of those attacks were able to leverage that particular simple kind of response, right? To say, hey, let me just curl the metadata service. That'll come back to you. V2, right, and added a few things in place to make this a lot more difficult, right? You have a session-oriented. We're moving from just a simple response request to a session-oriented request, right? So now we're going to say there's a token in place. We're going to ask for that token when it comes in. And then we're also going to enforce a couple other things along that, right? So a lot of the times these SSRF attacks will involve a proxy that's used, and they'll have an X-forwarded for header. So this is saying, hey, we're going to go through another platform essentially to now ask the instance to give us back those credentials. So this actually will include other methods as well, right? So you need to pass a token to the metadata service. This will actually pass that back, and then you're able to make that call with the token request. So we're adding another layer of complexity, a little bit more friction for the attacker as well. This is kind of a quick diagram here around how the attack would work just with V1. So we have a bad actor, right? An SSRF vulnerability is present on an instance itself, right, on the front end. And then there's a curl command that somebody may run, right, once they get access to the actual instance itself. So essentially the attacker is tricking the instance into thinking, hey, this is a normal request that I can make off the bat and talk to the metadata service and essentially get creds for whatever the instance is meant to do or what it's supposed to do. So these credentials are returned. The bad actor now has access to these credentials, and essentially whatever context this instance has is what will essentially take place inside of that AWS environment. So they could access, maybe you have something that this instance is doing that's talking to S3 or somewhere else, but the entire instance profile attached to the role that it has access to will go ahead and talk to different things there. And so too bad, right? Once we update to V2, this changes a lot, right? We're creating a lot more friction for the attacker themselves. You can actually see here, right, that the same attack flow would happen, but the attacker may not know that, hey, I actually need to pass a token now. So that's one step that you're adding into their attack for that complexity level, right? And if they're able to actually go through and hit the metadata service, there's even more complexity because this will get returned to the instance. That'll get back to the bad actor. But now we have all these other various things that are in place, which prevents the attack from actually being taking place in the first place, right? So the request could get denied without a token. That's properly there. There's a TTL attached to the actual session, right? Once you pull that token down, and then also there's a correct header that's enforcement with a proxy, right? So if you don't have all those things that are part of essentially V2, which now it's like a super complex attack to actually take place, you're preventing the attacker from using that essentially from outside of the AWS environment. And this is kind of leading us back to why it's important and like how we should go about like solving this problem. And the configurations for the instances themselves could live in infrastructure as code. So if you're using Terraform, if you're using CloudFormation or something like that, you can actually put that in as just like a configuration to say when this instance comes alive, let's actually make sure it's using V2 and just have that enforced. There's also like the enforcement of the session tokens, right? So we're going to ensure that every request to the metadata service is coming in with the token and not just a simple request that V1 would have before. And then also the proxy attack vector, right? So making sure that that header itself is not allowed, so we don't allow something from the outside to actually make that request on behalf of the instance. A lot of the times those attacks work that way, and then this will keep track of how that request is being made in the first place. And now we're coming down into the aspect of like, hey, do we need a tool for this? And like every good security person who's doing anything, right, you'll probably try to Google and see if there's a tool that exists for something, right? And what we did initially was try to figure out, hey, how do we get metrics around this? How do we understand where the problem exists? And you can actually do a couple things today where you can look at CloudWatch metrics and the EC2 API to understand where your metadata is being used and which version you're on. That exists out of the box inside of AWS today. So if you wanted to go into CloudWatch, actually pull those down, you could. And then we really wanted to understand, hey, can we also make sure that every new instance that comes alive is using V2 off the bat? And this can get really tricky once you're looking at accounts that have hundreds of thousands of instances across like multiple regions, and all these instances are doing different things across the board, right? So these are all kind of like problem sets within the tool itself of what we needed to think through. And just like from the preventative perspective of things, right, you could actually put in a control policy, right? So AWS has a concept of service control policies where you can actually just enforce certain things off the bat. So there's a thing where it'll actually update the IAM policy and say, hey, make sure every request that's coming through that's assigned to V2, and if not, don't let it pass. This could really break things pretty easily because some things just don't support V2 out of the box. So you have to be very careful when you're doing that. And then I think the last note there is just kind of like around enforcing this across every single instance. So you might have a lot of legacy infrastructure in your environment that only supports a V1 that may not have been updated in the past and so forth. So you have to be kind of careful about this, right? So we needed a tool to solve all these problems, and it's kind of what we started baking into the Metabadger itself. This is the simple like discovery process around how you'd go about solving this just on scale and in general, right? So you look at some of these existing metrics that you have, and then even logging for like CloudTrail to see, hey, which version of the metadata service am I using? And then how am I doing that, right? Is there user data being passed in? Is there a role being used? Are you running any software that could be for one version or the other? And sometimes there are. There's a known list of vendors out there, right, that like only support one version, or maybe they haven't updated to V2 yet because it's actually a change in the code of how they're talking to the metadata service. And the real test right after that is like once you do make the changes, you should really update some of those things and actually test them out in lower environments, right? So if you have dev and stage, make sure that everything's working as expected, because sometimes you might have calls that fail, you might have applications that start breaking, and then validating the logging, right? So once you get all that done, you can look at the logs to say, hey, is the metadata service still functioning as expected? Are these instances still doing what they're supposed to do? This is the tool itself, right? The tool solves a number of different things. We really wanted to understand, hey, like which version of IMDS are we on, right? To be able to pull those metrics down, check the role attachments to see like, hey, if you're using an IAM instance profile, right, with the role, you're probably using the metadata service to a degree, and then have like a lot of different various abilities about the metadata service itself. So let's enable it, let's be able to disable it, check it, and then even roll back if in case we break something and we want to fix this. So building all this into the tool, I think, was really helpful, and then even being granular about certain things, right? So like, let's say you're in your environment and instances for a fact can't actually, be updated. You can actually specify a tag where you want to apply this across the board. You can even specify like the CSV of instance IDs where you want to apply this. So giving folks, the ability to do that in a very granular manner, so you're not going to break things off the bat, and just have that sort of confidence that you can go into it and sort of fix a problem without running into larger issues, because that can get really tricky. This is the flow path of kind of how you'd use Metabadger, like all the way through and involving all the steps and so forth. You would essentially do the whole discovery process, right? Understanding your usage, and then seeing like what roles you use to get some context on that, as well as kind of figuring out where you're not using the IMDS service, because if you're not using it, it's probably best to just disable the attack surface altogether. This is just a vector that somebody could use, right? So if you're not using it, just turn it off. And then if you wanted to update, you can obviously do like a dry run of this, update to V2, and then validate that all those workloads are working correctly. And then on top of that, the tool will actually go through, get all the coverage metrics. You can do an analysis of like, hey, what impact do we change here? How many more instances are now using V2 versus V1? And then continuously audit this. So this is kind of a quick demo around like how the tool would work, right? So we just run a Metabadger discover metadata. This will go through and give you like a breakdown of how many instances are on V1 versus V2. So we have 0% there. We're doing some discovery of roles, right, to see, oh yeah, maybe some of these instances are using roles, and then actually going through and updating all of these. And the tool will just go through and scroll and kind of hit the EC2 API and update those to say only use V2 on those instances. And then, yeah, that's kind of it. And then after that, you can run the discover metadata command again, and then it'll give you the metric on that. And just a quick, kind of reference on here. This is kind of where the code lives itself. That's my Twitter handle. And then I wanted to just give a quick shout out to Kinnaird. So Kinnaird wrote Cloudsplaining and a couple other cloud security tools as well. Super neat, and helped with a lot of like these problem sets that I was thinking through along the way. And so definitely encourage folks to use the tool. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. And definitely, excited to see this come to life. And I've seen so many folks download it over the last year or so. And also, I think it's kind of a problem that exists across the board there. But yeah, thanks for your time. And is there any questions? I don't think I can see anything.
Is there a way to set V2 globally for an org?
Yeah, so like kind of going back to the SCP thing, you could probably set that at the top level and then enforce it off the bat. But if you have like stuff that's running on V1, you'd have to go in there and manually just make the change. Yep. Cool. Anybody else? I see any hands. All right. Awesome. Thanks again.